Picture this. It's the year 1162. The place is a windswept grassland in the middle of Asia, a place so remote, so wild, so vast that it seems like it belongs to no one. There are no cities here, no schools, no grocery stores, no roads, just miles and miles and miles of grass, called the steppe, stretching in every direction, all the way to the horizon. On this enormous empty plain, a baby boy was born into a tiny tribe of nomadic warriors. His family owned a few horses, a few animals, and a felt tent called a ger. They moved from place to place, following their herds. When it rained, they got wet. When it was cold, and it got very cold, they huddled together for warmth. Nobody in the world, not the king of China, not the sultan of Persia, not the emperor of Rome, would have paid any attention to this tiny baby boy, born in a tent on the edge of nowhere. But that baby would grow up to build the largest empire in the history of the entire world. His name was Temujin. Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are telling one of the most incredible stories in all of human history, the life of Genghis Khan. Now, before we jump in, let me ask you something. What do you think makes a great leader? Is it strength, intelligence, courage, being born into a royal family? Genghis Khan had some of those things, but what makes his story truly unbelievable is what he didn't have. He wasn't born in a palace. He wasn't born rich. He wasn't handed an army. He didn't even have a proper education. He started with almost nothing. And yet, by the time his life was over, his empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean all the way to Eastern Europe, covering more land than any empire before or since. So how does a kid born in a tent on an empty grassland end up ruling half the known world? That's what we're going to find out today. And buckle up, because this story has kidnappings, betrayals, impossible battles, incredible friendships, and some of the most dramatic moments in all of history. Chapter 1. A boy born with a clot of blood. Let's go back to the very beginning. The year was around 1162 CE. CE stands for Common Era. It's just a way historians mark time. And in that year, in a region called Mongolia, right in the heart of Central Asia, a child was born to a man named Yesugei and a woman named Hoilan. Now here's something really fascinating right from the start. According to the ancient Mongolian historical text called The Secret History of the Mongols, which is one of the oldest books ever written about this story, when baby Temujin was born, he came into the world clutching a clot of blood in his tiny fist. In Mongolian culture at the time, this was seen as a powerful sign. People believed it meant the child was destined to be a great warrior. Now we can't know for sure if that's true. It might be a legend. But what is true is that this baby would grow up to be one of the most powerful warriors the world has ever seen. So maybe those ancient Mongolians were onto something. His name, Temujin, was taken from a rival Tatar warrior that his father had just defeated in battle right before the birth. In Mongolian tradition, naming a child after a conquered enemy was a way of saying, "Our family is strong. Don't mess with us." Temujin was born into a world of almost constant conflict. Mongolia in the 12th century was not a unified country. Instead, it was home to dozens of different tribes, groups of people who each had their own leaders, their own territories, and their own traditions. These tribes were constantly competing with each other. They raided each other's herds, they kidnapped each other's women, they fought over the best pastures and the cleanest rivers. Life on the Mongolian steppe was beautiful and brutal at the same time. The Mongols were nomads, meaning they didn't live in one fixed place. They moved their families and their animals from one grazing ground to another, following the seasons. They were expert horseback riders from a very young age. In fact, most Mongolian children could ride a horse before they could walk properly on their own 2 feet. Think about that. You're learning to walk, and meanwhile your Mongolian neighbor is already trotting around on a pony. Young Temujin grew up learning to ride, to hunt, and to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Winters in Mongolia can drop to -40 degrees. That's the same in Celsius and Fahrenheit. Equally, terrifyingly cold. Summers on the steppe burn hot and dry, and the wind never seems to stop. It was a tough life, but it built tough people. Temujin had brothers, Kasar, Kajian, and Temugay, and a half-brother named Begta. He also had a sister named Temulan. The family lived in their ger, moved their flocks, and stayed close to their tribe,
the Borjigin clan. Life was okay, but that was about to change forever. Coming up, a tragedy that would shape everything about who Temujin would become. And you are not going to believe what happens next.
Chapter 2: Poison, Kidnapping, and Survival.
Temujin was around 9 or 10 years old when his father, Yasuge, decided it was time to do something very important. In Mongolian tradition, when a boy was old enough, his father would find him a bride, a girl he would one day marry when they were both grown up. The families would make an agreement, and the boy would go live with the girl's family for a while, helping out and getting to know them. So Yasuge packed up young Temujin, and the two of them rode off together across the steppe to find a suitable match. Along the way, they stopped at the camp of a tribe called the Ongirat, and there, Yasuge spotted a young girl named Berthe. She was described, even in historical records, as having bright eyes and a radiant face. Yasuge was impressed. He struck a deal with Berthe's father, a man named Day Sechen, and Temujin was left behind to live with Berthe's family while his father returned home. Now, here's where things go terribly wrong. On his way home, Yasuge stopped to eat and drink with a group of Tatars. Remember the Tatars? They were a rival tribe, and they recognized Yasuge. They didn't attack him openly. That would have been against the rules of Mongolian hospitality. But they did something sneakier and more dangerous. They poisoned his food. Yasuge made it back to his camp, but he arrived gravely ill. He sent a messenger to find Temujin and bring him home. Temujin rode as fast as he could, but by the time he arrived, his father was dying. Yasuge, leader of the Borjigin clan, died. Temujin was 10 years old. Here's something you need to understand. In Mongolian nomadic society, a tribe's strength came from its leader. Without a strong leader, a tribe could fall apart very quickly. Other more powerful tribes would take advantage. Members would leave and join stronger groups, and that is exactly what happened. The men of the Borjigin clan, the tribe Yasuge had led, abandoned the family. They said that a widow and her young children couldn't lead them. They packed up and left, taking the tribe's animals and food with them. Hoelen, Temujin's mother, was left on the steppe with her children and very little else. She was one of the most remarkable women in this whole story. Instead of giving up, Hoelen fought. She foraged for food along the riverbanks, digging up roots and picking wild berries. She kept her children alive through brutal winters. She taught them to survive. The Mongolian word for mother is edge, pronounced like edge without the dg. In Mongolian culture, mothers were deeply respected and held tremendous moral authority in the family. Hoelen's strength during this period is celebrated in Mongolian cultural memory to this day. But survival was about more than just food. Temujin had an older half-brother named Begta. Begta was the son of Yasuge's second wife, and with their father gone, Begta tried to assert authority over the family. He began stealing food, taking birds and fish that Temujin and his brother Kasar had caught. This was serious. On the steppe, stealing food from your own family wasn't just rude, it could mean the difference between life and death. What happened next is one of the most controversial moments in Temujin's life. He and his brother Kasar confronted Begta, and they killed him. This is a moment that historians have debated for centuries. Was it cold-blooded? Was it survival? Was it a terrible mistake or a calculated decision? We can't know for sure. What we do know is that Temujin was around 12 or 13 years old, living in desperate conditions, and he was already making decisions that no child should ever have to make. Chapter 3: Berthe, Brotherhood, and Betrayal. As Temujin grew into a young man, he did something that might surprise you. In the middle of all this chaos, the poverty, the struggle, the violence, he went back to collect his promised bride. He rode to the camp of the Ongirat tribe, and true to their agreement, Berthe's family welcomed him. He and Berthe were married. Now, this wasn't just a marriage. This was a strategic move, too. Temujin was building connections, allies who would stand by him. Berthe's family brought prestige and alliances, and Berthe herself, she would become one of the most important people in Temujin's life, not just as a wife, but as a trusted advisor. Historical accounts suggest Temujin listened to Berte's counsel throughout his life, which was unusual and remarkable for his time and place. Berte was the first and most senior of Temujin's wives. In Mongolian tradition, powerful leaders sometimes had multiple wives, but Berte held a special, honored status above all others. Their children, sons Yochi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui, would go on to inherit parts of the empire their father built. As a wedding gift, Berte's mother gave her daughter a magnificent black sable fur coat. This gift would soon play an unexpected but important role in Temujin's rise to power. Temujin knew that on the steppe, you couldn't survive alone. You needed allies, you needed blood brothers, men bound to you by loyalty even stronger than family ties. In Mongolian culture, this bond was called Unda. An Unda was a sworn brother, not born from the same mother, but chosen through a ceremony and an oath. Temujin had one Unda who would become legendary, a man named Jamaka. The two of them had been childhood friends. Now, as young men, they renewed their bond. They exchanged gifts. They made oaths. Jamaka was charismatic, intelligent, and a natural leader in his own right. For a while, the two friends were inseparable, riding together, camping together, strategizing together. But there was a third relationship that would define Temujin's early rise. He approached a powerful man named Togrul, the leader of a Christian Mongolian tribe called the Karaite. Togrul had been an Unda of Temujin's late father, Yesagay. Temujin brought him a gift, Berte's magnificent sable fur coat, and asked for his protection and support. Togrul agreed. The alliance was made. For a brief moment, it looked like Temujin's world was finally coming together. And then, disaster struck again. A tribe called the Merkits, enemies who had never forgiven Temujin's father for a kidnapping that had happened decades before, attacked Temujin's camp in the middle of the night. Temujin barely escaped in the darkness, but Berte was not so lucky. The Merkits captured her and took her away. For any man of the steppe, having his wife taken was a profound shame and a devastating personal loss. Temujin was devastated, but he did not fall apart. Instead, he acted. He called on his alliance with Togrul and Jamika. The three of them gathered their warriors. Historical accounts suggest they assembled a force of around 20,000 men and launched a rescue mission into Merkit territory. The attack was swift and overwhelming. The Merkits were scattered, and Berte was found and rescued. This military campaign revealed something crucial about Temujin. He was not just a survivor. He was an organizer, a strategist, a leader who could bring different groups together and coordinate them toward a single goal. People were starting to notice. Followers began to gather around him, men who had heard his reputation, men who had seen what he was capable of, men who had been lost after their own clans fell apart and were looking for a strong leader to follow. Temujin welcomed them all. He did something that was revolutionary for the time. He didn't just accept people from his own clan. He accepted anyone, regardless of which tribe they came from, as long as they were loyal to him. His star was rising, but his old friend Jamaka? Well, that friendship was about to get complicated. Keep watching, because the rivalry between these two men would tear the Mongolian world in two. Chapter 4. The Great Rivalry. Temujin versus Jamaka. Temujin and Jamaka had been best friends, blood brothers. But power has a way of turning even the closest friends into rivals. The break came gradually. Jamaka was a brilliant leader too, and he led his own growing coalition of tribes. He believed in the old system, where tribal aristocracy mattered, where you were born into your rank. Temujin believed in something different, that the best person for the job should get the job, regardless of where they came from. These were two very different visions for what Mongolian society could be, and they couldn't both win. Around 1187 CE, the two factions clashed in a battle called the Battle of Dalan Baljut. Jamaka won. It was a significant defeat for Temujin, and for a while he had to retreat and rebuild. But Temujin was not someone who stayed down for long. He spent years rebuilding, expanding his network, winning over new clans, demonstrating his military brilliance in smaller raids and campaigns. He earned a massive reputation as a fair leader. When he conquered an enemy tribe, he didn't automatically kill or enslave everyone. He offered survivors the choice to join him, and many took it. This was unusual, and it worked. Temujin also introduced a radical new policy. He banned the looting of enemy camps by individual soldiers until the battle was fully won. This kept his army disciplined and coordinated, instead of falling apart into chaos the moment they smelled victory, which was a common problem in the armies of his time. By the early 1200s, Temujin had become one of the most powerful leaders on the steppe. The old coalition that had supported Jamaka began to fracture. One by one, tribes and clans switched sides. The final showdown between Temujin and Jamaka came in 1204 CE, at the Battle of Naiman. By this point, Jamaka had allied himself with the last few tribes still opposing Temujin. But Temujin's forces were better organized, better equipped, and frankly better led. The battle was decisive. Temujin's forces won. Jamaka's coalition collapsed. Jamaka himself was eventually captured. What happened next was both sad and revealing. Temujin offered his old friend mercy and offered to join him, to be restored to honor. He didn't want to execute the man who had once been his sworn brother. But Jamaka refused. He reportedly said that two suns cannot shine in one sky. He asked for a death without bloodshed, considered an honorable death in Mongolian culture. Temujin granted his request. It was the end of an era. With Jamaka gone, there was no longer any rival on the Mongolian steppe powerful enough to challenge Temujin. In 1206 CE, something happened that would change the world forever. The leaders of all the Mongolian tribes, enemies who had once fought each other, allies who had supported Temujin from the beginning, clans large and small from across the entire steppe, gathered together at a grand assembly called a Kurultai. A great white banner with 9 tails, the symbol of Mongolian rule, was raised. And Temujin was given a new name, Genghis Khan. The boy born in a tent on the edge of nowhere was now the ruler of a unified Mongolian nation, something that had never existed before in history. But if you think the story ends there, you have no idea what's coming next. Chapter 5: Building the Nation. Laws, loyalty, and an army unlike any other. Becoming Genghis Khan wasn't just about getting a cool new name. It was about building something from scratch, a nation, a government, and a military machine that the world had never seen before. And Genghis Khan got to work immediately. The first thing he did was create a new legal code, a set of rules that everyone in his empire had to follow. This code was called the Yasa, sometimes written as Jasag. It covered everything from how to treat enemies, to rules about trade, to the punishment for theft and murder. Some of the laws were harsh by modern standards, but some were surprisingly fair for the time. The Yasa included protections for merchants and travelers. Anyone crossing Mongol territory was guaranteed safe passage as long as they obeyed the rules. This turned Mongol-controlled lands into some of the safest trade routes in the world. Genghis Khan established a postal relay system across his empire called the Yam. It was a network of stations spaced about 25 miles apart, where riders could swap tired horses for fresh ones. A message could travel hundreds of miles in just a few days. In the 13th century, that was basically the ancient equivalent of sending an email. Next came the army. Genghis Khan reorganized his warriors into a system called a decimal system. Groups were divided into squads of 10, called an arban, companies of 100, a zun, regiments of 1,000, a mingan, and divisions of 10,000, a tumen. Every unit had a clear commander. Every commander was responsible for the fighting ability and behavior of his men. This was revolutionary. Most armies of the time were loosely organized groups of men who followed a chief. Genghis Khan's army was more like a precision machine, coordinated, disciplined, and trained to follow complex battlefield orders. And here's something very important. Genghis Khan promoted his commanders based on ability and loyalty, not based on their family background or which tribe they came from. A man born into a poor family could rise to command 10,000 warriors if he proved himself skilled and loyal. His most trusted generals became known as the Nukud, companions, and they were fiercely devoted to him. Among the most famous were Jebe, Subutai, Jelme, and Kubilai, warriors of extraordinary skill who would help carry Mongol armies across thousands of miles of territory. The Mongol cavalry was also technically superior to almost anything their enemies had. Mongolian horses were short and sturdy, not the most beautiful animals, but they were incredibly tough, able to survive cold winters, travel vast distances without much food, and change direction at lightning speed. Mongolian archers were among the most skilled in the world. They could shoot with deadly accuracy from a galloping horse, standing up in their stirrups, twisting in the saddle, firing backward while retreating. It was an astounding military skill that terrified their enemies. One of their most famous tactics was the feigned retreat, or false retreat. They would ride toward an enemy force, shoot arrows, and then turn and run as if they were fleeing. The enemy, thinking they had won, would charge after them in a disordered mob. And then, at just the right moment, the Mongols would wheel around and destroy the pursuing army. They did this over and over again, and somehow, unbelievably, enemy generals kept falling for it. Genghis Khan was also brilliant at gathering intelligence. Before he attacked any new territory, he sent spies, often disguised as merchants or traders, to learn everything about the enemy, their city walls, their army size, their morale, their leaders, the roads in and out. Knowledge was power, and Genghis Khan used every advantage he could find. With his nation unified, his laws written, and his army primed, Genghis Khan looked out from the Mongolian steppe and turned his gaze to the south, to China. Get ready, because what happens next is one of the greatest military campaigns in history. Chapter 6: The War Against the Jin Dynasty, Taking on China. South of Mongolia lay one of the most powerful empires on earth, the Jin dynasty, which controlled northern China. The Jin were wealthy, sophisticated, and militarily powerful. They had enormous walled cities, professional armies, and some of the most advanced siege weapons and fortifications in the world. They also had the Great Wall of China. The Great Wall was one of the most impressive defensive structures ever built, designed specifically to keep northern nomads like the Mongols out of China. Genghis Khan looked at the Great Wall, and he went around it. Well, partly. It's more complicated than that. The Mongols didn't just ignore the wall. They bypassed it in certain places, bribed guards in others, and used their intelligence networks to find weak points. But the fundamental truth is this: a wall only works if you have enough soldiers to defend every section of it, and the Jin dynasty stretched too far to defend perfectly. In 1211 CE, Genghis Khan led his armies into Jin territory. What followed was 4 years of intense military campaigning, sieges, open battles, and strategic maneuvering that shocked the Jin court to its core. Now, the Mongols had one major problem. They were extraordinary cavalry fighters, but cavalry, men on horses, cannot easily knock down stone walls. For that you need siege weapons, machines like catapults, battering rams, and trebuchets. Genghis Khan solved this problem the same way he solved most problems. He learned. He recruited Chinese engineers, experts in siege technology, and brought them into his army. He learned to build and use catapults. He learned techniques for diverting rivers to flood enemy cities. He combined his cavalry brilliance with Chinese engineering expertise. The result was devastating. Jin cities that had seemed impenetrable began to fall, one by one. The Jin emperor, alarmed and desperate, moved his capital from Zhongdu, near modern Beijing, further south, hoping to put more distance between himself and the Mongol advance. In 1215 CE, the city of Zhongdu itself, one of the great cities of the medieval world, fell to the Mongols. An eyewitness account written by a Chinese official described the bones of the dead piled like mountains outside the ruined walls, white bones bleaching in the sun for miles. It was a scene of almost incomprehensible destruction. We have to be honest here. The Mongol conquests were not just thrilling military victories. They involved enormous amounts of violence and suffering. Millions of people died. Cities were destroyed. Populations that resisted were sometimes massacred. Genghis Khan used terror as a deliberate military strategy. The message was simple and brutal. Surrender and you will be treated fairly. Resist and you will be destroyed. Many cities did surrender, choosing survival over pride. But those that chose to fight faced terrible consequences. History is complicated. Genghis Khan was simultaneously one of the greatest military geniuses who ever lived, and responsible for some of the most catastrophic loss of life in medieval history. We have to hold both of those truths at the same time. But the campaign against the Jin dynasty was just the beginning. While his generals continued the pressure in northern China, Genghis Khan himself turned his attention to the west. And what was waiting in the west was an empire that would test the Mongols like nothing had before.
Chapter 7. The Khwarezmian Catastrophe. The War That Changed Everything. To the west of Mongolia and beyond the great steppes of Central Asia lay the Khwarezmian Empire. It was a massive, wealthy, and sophisticated Islamic empire that controlled much of modern-day Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan. Its cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Urgench, were among the most beautiful and culturally rich in the entire medieval world. These cities were centers of learning. Scholars wrote books about mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Merchants traded silk, spices, and precious stones. Artists created breathtaking architecture. These were not small, quiet towns. They were thriving metropolises with populations in the hundreds of thousands. Now, Genghis Khan actually wanted to be friends with the Khwarezmian Empire, or at least trade partners. He sent a large trade caravan, 450 Muslim merchants carrying gold, silver, silk, and other precious goods, to the Khwarezmian Shah, a ruler named Muhammad II. Shah Muhammad made one of the worst decisions in the history of the world. He had the entire caravan arrested. He accused the merchants of being spies, and then he had them all executed. Genghis Khan sent a diplomatic envoy, ambassadors, to demand an explanation and compensation. Shah Muhammad responded by killing one of the ambassadors and shaving the heads of the others, sending them back to Genghis Khan as a humiliation. What happened next is described by historians as one of the most devastating military campaigns in history. Genghis Khan was furious. Not just angry, this was a deep, cold, calculated rage. To kill ambassadors was one of the most serious violations of the laws that held civilized societies together. To disrespect him so openly was to issue a declaration of war. He assembled an army. Estimates vary, but most historians suggest between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors, and marched west. What followed between 1219 and 1221 CE was the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire. The Mongols used multiple tactics that were far ahead of their time. They split their forces into separate armies, attacking from different directions simultaneously. Shah Muhammad couldn't concentrate his defenses because the threat came from everywhere at once. The city of Bukhara fell in 1220 CE. Genghis Khan reportedly rode into the great mosque of the city and delivered a speech saying that the people's sins had brought this punishment upon them. Then the city was burned. Samarkand, perhaps the greatest jewel of the Islamic world at the time, a city of perhaps 400,000 people, surrendered after a brief siege. Its people were mostly spared, but its defenders were killed and its treasures taken. City after city fell. Once one of the largest cities in the world was destroyed so completely that it took centuries to recover. Urgench was flooded when the Mongols diverted a river through it. The human cost was catastrophic. Some historians estimate that millions of people died in the destruction of Khwarezm. From battle, from starvation, from disease that followed in the wake of war. The great intellectual centers of Central Asia, the libraries, the schools, the centers of medicine and mathematics, were shattered. Some scholars argue that the destruction of these cities set Islamic civilization back by hundreds of years. Others note that recovery eventually came, that great cities like Samarkand were rebuilt and eventually flourished again. But in the short term, the devastation was almost unimaginable. Shah Muhammad II fled, hunted by a Mongol cavalry force under the legendary generals Jebe and Subutai. He ran for months, from city to city, always one step ahead. He ended his days as a fugitive, dying on a small island in the Caspian Sea, reportedly without even a proper burial shroud, because he had nothing left. His son, Jalal ad-Din,
tried to rally resistance. He actually defeated a Mongol force in battle, one of the very few people ever to do so, but he couldn't hold out against the full weight of the Mongol onslaught. He eventually fled into India. The Khwarezmian Empire was gone. One of the wealthiest and most powerful empires in the medieval world had been destroyed in just 3 years. And while all of this was happening in the west, Genghis Khan's generals, Jebe and Subutai, kept riding. They went further west than any Mongol army ever had, through Persia, through the Caucasus Mountains, into what is today Russia and Ukraine. They defeated the Georgian kingdom. They fought the Cumans on the Russian steppe. In 1223 CE, at the Battle of the Kalka River, they crushed a combined army of Russian princes and their Cuman allies. And then, having gone further west than any army in Mongol history, they turned around and rode back to report to Genghis Khan. It was one of the greatest cavalry raids in military history, a loop of more than 5,000 miles across some of the most challenging terrain in Eurasia. Coming up, one more great campaign, one more corner of the world to bring to heel, and then the end of an extraordinary life. Chapter 8. The Return to China, the Final Campaign. After the destruction of Khwarezm, Genghis Khan returned to Mongolia. He was in his 60s now, an old man by the standards of his time. But age had not dulled his determination. There was one piece of unfinished business that had been nagging at him. To the northwest of China lay a kingdom called the Western Shah, sometimes written as Shisha, ruled by the Tangut people.
The Tanguts had been vassals of the Mongols, meaning they acknowledged Mongol supremacy and paid tribute.
But they had refused to send troops to help with the Khwarezmian campaign, calling on an old Mongolian custom that gave them the right to decline.
Genghis Khan had not forgotten, and he had not forgiven. In 1226 CE, Genghis Khan personally led his armies against the Shisha. Despite being in his 60s and reportedly suffering from injuries sustained in a hunting accident, he was thrown from his horse and badly hurt. He refused to leave the campaign. The Shisha kingdom was systematically conquered. City by city, fortress by fortress, it fell before the Mongol advance. But as the campaign neared its conclusion, Genghis Khan's health was failing. In the summer of 1227 CE, in a military camp somewhere in the Shisha territory, the exact location is still debated by historians, Genghis Khan, the ruler of the largest contiguous empire in history, died. He was approximately 65 years old. The exact cause of his death is uncertain. Some accounts say it was complications from his hunting injury. Others suggest typhoid fever or another illness. A few sources claim wounds from battle. We simply don't know for sure. According to his wishes, and this is one of the most remarkable things about this story, his burial place was kept secret. His body was carried back to Mongolia. According to legend, everyone encountered along the route was killed so that no one could betray the location. The soldiers who buried him then rode their horses back and forth over the grave to hide any trace of it. Then, according to some accounts, they diverted a river over the burial site. To this day, the tomb of Genghis Khan has never been found. It is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of history. Chapter 9. The world he left behind, the Mongol Empire after Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was gone, but what he had started, that was far from over. When he died, Genghis Khan had already put plans in place for what would happen next. His empire would be divided among his sons, each one ruling a portion, while recognizing the overall authority of a great Khan. His son Ogedei was chosen as the next great Khan, and he continued the campaigns his father had begun. Under Ogedei's leadership, the Mongols completed the conquest of the Jin dynasty in China in 1234. They invaded Korea. They pushed into Poland and Hungary in 1241, defeating European armies so decisively that the rulers of Western Europe genuinely believed the apocalypse had begun. In 1241, a Mongol army under General Subutai defeated a Polish-German army at the Battle of Legnica and a Hungarian royal army at the Battle of Mohi, within just 2 days of each other, despite the two battlefields being hundreds of miles apart. The Mongols were operating multiple armies across vast distances with a level of coordination that the medieval world simply could not match. The Mongols only turned back from Western Europe because Ergedei Khan died, and the generals had to return to Mongolia for the succession assembly. Western Europe was quite literally saved by a death in the family. Under Genghis Khan's grandsons, the empire continued to expand. Kublai Khan, perhaps the most famous of the successors, completed the conquest of China, establishing the Yuan dynasty and ruling as Emperor of China. He was the one visited by the Venetian explorer Marco Polo, whose accounts of the magnificent Mongol court astonished European readers. But the Mongols eventually met their limits. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine, the Mongol advance was stopped by Egyptian Mamluk forces, the first major defeat of a Mongol army in the field. The Mamluks used tactics similar to the Mongols' own: feigned retreat, disciplined cavalry, and it worked.
Japan twice repelled Mongol invasion fleets, in 1274 and 1281, when typhoons destroyed the Mongol ships, storms that the Japanese called kamikaze, meaning divine wind. The great empire gradually fragmented into 4 separate khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia and Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. They fought each other, they adopted the religions and cultures of the people they ruled. Eventually, they faded into history. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Mongol Empire as a unified force was gone, but its effects on the world were permanent. Chapter 10. Was Genghis Khan a monster or a marvel?
The complicated legacy. Now here's something I want to talk with you about directly. Because when we study history, especially history involving someone as powerful and complicated as Genghis Khan, we have to ask hard questions. Was Genghis Khan a good person? That question doesn't have a simple answer. And that's okay.
History is rarely simple.
On one hand, the Mongol conquests caused unimaginable suffering. The death toll from the Mongol campaigns is estimated by historians at somewhere between 30 and 40 million people, though some estimates go higher. Cities were destroyed. Cultures were disrupted.
Populations that had thrived for centuries were devastated.
Some regions of Central Asia and Persia took hundreds of years to recover their pre-conquest population levels. The Mongol invasions are considered one of the deadliest events in human history, proportional to the world population at the time. That is a devastating fact, and it must be acknowledged honestly. On the other hand, Genghis Khan built something that for a period of time actually made the world more connected. Under Mongol rule, the trade routes connecting China to Europe, later called the Silk Road, were safer than they had ever been. Merchants could travel from the Pacific coast to the Mediterranean with less fear of bandits or regional wars. This period is sometimes called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongolian Peace. This trade and travel had enormous consequences. Ideas, technologies, and goods moved between civilizations that had been largely isolated from each other. Chinese paper money influenced financial systems westward. Islamic astronomical knowledge traveled east. European fashions and goods appeared in Chinese markets. Some historians believe the Pax Mongolica played a role in eventually bringing the Black Death, the bubonic plague, from Asia to Europe in the 1340s, as the disease traveled along the trade routes that the Mongols had made safe and busy. So even the consequences of Mongol peace were complicated. Genghis Khan also had some policies that were remarkably progressive for his time. He established religious freedom across his empire, an unusual policy in an era when wars were frequently fought over religion. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and followers of traditional Mongolian shamanism all practiced their faiths under Mongol rule without persecution. Genghis Khan himself followed the traditional Mongolian faith but was curious about all religions. He established diplomatic immunity for ambassadors, the idea that messengers between rulers should never be harmed, which is a principle still followed in international law today. He promoted based on ability rather than birth. He valued loyalty and competence over aristocratic bloodlines. In a world where most societies rigidly determined a person's fate at birth, this was genuinely radical.
So who was Genghis Khan? He was a man who rose from nothing through intelligence, willpower, and an extraordinary ability to organize and lead people. He was a military genius of the highest order,
studied by generals and military academies to this day. He was a lawmaker and an administrator who built systems that held an enormous empire together. He was also someone who used terrifying violence as a tool of conquest, someone who caused the deaths of millions, someone who destroyed irreplaceable libraries, cities, and cultures. He was all of these things at once, and holding that complexity, understanding that real historical figures are rarely all good or all bad. That's one of the most important skills we can develop as we learn about the past. The past is not a simple place. History is full of complicated people who did complicated things. Our job is not to simply cheer for the heroes and boo the villains. Our job is to understand, really understand, what happened, why it happened, and what we can learn from it. And Genghis Khan gives us a lot to learn from. Chapter 11. The numbers that blow your mind. Scale of the empire. Okay, let's take a moment to truly appreciate the sheer scale of what Genghis Khan created. Because sometimes numbers tell a story better than words. The Mongol Empire at its height covered approximately 24 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, the entire continent of Africa is about 30 million square kilometers. The United States is about 9.8 million square kilometers. The Mongol Empire was roughly 2.5 times the size of the entire United States. At its height, the Mongol Empire governed roughly 100 million people, about 1/4 of the entire world's population at the time. From the Pacific coast of China to the eastern edges of Poland and Hungary, all of it was, at various points, under Mongol control or Mongol influence. That's more than 5,000 miles in a straight line. And Genghis Khan built the foundation of all this in roughly 40 years, starting from nothing, from a tent on the steppe, from a family that had been abandoned by their tribe. He went from orphaned, homeless child to ruler of the greatest empire in history in the span of one lifetime. There has been no empire in the history of the world that covered more contiguous land. That means land all connected together, not separate islands, than the Mongol Empire. Not the Roman Empire. Not the British Empire, despite being bigger overall. Not Alexander the Great's empire. No one. In the history of the human species, no single person has left a larger mark on the map of the world than Genghis Khan. That is either the most thrilling or the most sobering thing in this entire video, depending on how you look at it. Chapter 12. Did you know? Surprising facts about Genghis Khan. Before we wrap up, let's spend a moment on some of the most surprising and fascinating facts about Genghis Khan that most people don't know. Surprising fact number 1. We don't know what he looked like. There are no portraits of Genghis Khan that were made during his lifetime that we know are accurate. The images we have were mostly created after his death, by artists in different countries who had never seen him. Some show him with a beard and East Asian features. Others show him very differently. One Persian historical text describes him as tall, with a long beard and cat eyes, meaning strong, penetrating eyes, but that's about as close as we get. Surprising fact number 2. He was probably not his son Jochi's biological father. Remember when Borta was captured by the Merkits? She was held prisoner for some time before Temujin rescued her. When she returned, she was pregnant. Her first son Jochi was born shortly after her rescue. This created a cloud of uncertainty. Genghis Khan publicly acknowledged Jochi as his son, and Jochi served loyally in the Mongol military. But the question of Jochi's parentage was never fully resolved, and it caused tensions within the family, particularly between Jochi and his half-brother Chagatai, who reportedly taunted Jochi about it. Surprising fact number 3. He may have more living descendants than any other person in history. A landmark genetic study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2003 found that approximately 8% of men in a large region of Asia, that's roughly 16 million people at the time of the study, share a Y chromosome that appears to descend from a common ancestor who lived in Mongolia around 1,000 years ago. Many scientists believe this ancestor was Genghis Khan, or possibly one of his close male relatives. If this is correct, roughly 0.5% of all the men alive on Earth today might be descended from Genghis Khan. That is a staggering number. Genghis Khan may have the most direct biological descendants of any individual human being in recorded history. Surprising fact number 4. He was deeply superstitious and religious. Genghis Khan followed the traditional Mongolian spiritual practice called Tengrism, a faith centered on the sky god Tengri and the belief that nature was filled with spiritual forces. He regularly sought guidance from shamans, spiritual leaders who could communicate with the spirit world. He was also deeply fascinated by other religions. He had long conversations with Taoist monks, Muslim scholars, Buddhist teachers, and Christian priests. He seemed genuinely curious about spiritual truth, even if he maintained his own traditional beliefs. Surprising fact number 5. He hated being called Genghis Khan. Well, sort of. Was one given to him by the assembly of tribal leaders in 1206. But in private, among family and close companions, he was known by his birth name, Temujin. That was the name his mother gave him, and names given by mothers are precious things. The boy who became the most powerful ruler in history always carried with him the name of the frightened child who had survived the steppe.
Chapter 13. Why does Genghis Khan still matter today?
You might be wondering, why are we studying someone who lived 800 years ago? What does a Mongolian warrior from the 13th century have to do with your life today? More than you might think. The political map of Central Asia, the borders of countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Mongolia, and parts of China and Russia, were shaped in part by the Mongol conquests and the way the Mongol Empire divided and eventually dissolved. The explosion of trade and cultural exchange during the Pax Mongolica helped accelerate the period of exploration and discovery that followed. Ideas and technologies that crossed continents during Mongol rule contributed to the Renaissance in Europe and developments in science and navigation that eventually led European explorers to reach the Americas. The very concept of international trade law, the idea that merchants traveling between countries deserve protection and fair treatment, owes something to the Mongol postal and trade system. Diplomatic immunity, the rule that ambassadors from foreign countries cannot be arrested or harmed while doing their jobs, is today written into international law. And while the principle existed in various cultures before the Mongols, Genghis Khan enforced it fiercely and across a wider area than anyone before him. And in Mongolia today, the country that sits on that vast, windy steppe where it all began, Genghis Khan is a national hero of the highest order. His face is on the currency. The main airport in the capital city, Ulaanbaatar, is named after him. There is a massive statue of him on horseback, one of the largest equestrian statues in the world, gleaming silver on the steppe about 54 kilometers outside the city. For Mongolians, Genghis Khan is not primarily a symbol of conquest and destruction. He is the father of their nation, the man who took a collection of warring tribes and forged them into a people with a shared identity, laws, and a place in history. History looks different depending on where you stand to look at it. In China, in Persia, in Russia, the memory of the Mongol conquests is associated with destruction and trauma. In Mongolia, it's associated with national pride and cultural identity. Who is right? Maybe everyone, maybe no one. Maybe that's exactly the point. Great history doesn't give you simple answers, it gives you better questions, and the story of Genghis Khan gives us some of the most important questions we can ask. What makes a great leader? Is greatness the same as goodness? Can someone build something remarkable while also causing tremendous harm? How do we judge people from the past by the standards of their own time, and how do we hold them to standards of basic human decency that transcend any era? These are the questions that historians, philosophers, and students just like you have been wrestling with for centuries, and now they're yours to wrestle with too.
Let's come back to where we started.
A baby boy born in a tent in the middle of nowhere in the year 1162. His father was killed when he was 10. His tribe abandoned his family. He was kidnapped, enslaved, and humiliated. He grew up in poverty on one of the harshest landscapes on earth, and from that beginning, from nothing, he built the largest empire the world has ever seen. Now I want to be careful here. I'm not telling you this story because hardship automatically leads to greatness. It doesn't. Millions of people throughout history have suffered tremendous hardship and never got the chances that Temujin did. Suffering isn't a superpower. That would be too simple and not true. What I am saying is this: the circumstances of your beginning do not have to determine the story of your entire life. Temujin was told again and again, by the world around him, by poverty, by his enemies, by the cruelty of powerful people, that he was nothing, that he didn't matter, that he would not survive. He refused to believe it. He looked at the world around him, and instead of seeing walls, he saw possibilities. He looked at his enemies, and instead of only seeing threats, he saw things he could learn from them. He looked at people from other tribes, people who were supposed to be his enemies, and he saw potential allies. He was always learning, always adapting, always asking, how can I do this better? Now, he also made choices that caused devastating harm. We've talked about that honestly today, and it's important not to forget it. Great capacity can be used for tremendous good or tremendous destruction, and Temujin chose, time and again, to use his power through conquest and violence. His is not simply a story of inspiration. It is a story of complexity, of how power works, of what happens when ambition has no limits, of the cost paid by millions of ordinary people when empires rise. But it is also, at its core, a deeply human story. A story about a child who survived things that would have broken most of us. A story about friendship and betrayal, about love, his love for Bertie, his loyalty to the companions who stood by him, about grief, about rage, and about what a person can build when they refuse to stop. Genghis Khan, universal ruler, destroyer of empires, father of a nation, monster, marvel, mystery. He was all of those things. He was human, and his story, this story that started with a baby born in a tent in the middle of nowhere, changed the course of history for every single person who has lived on this earth in the 800 years since his death. That's the power of one life. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end. That means you are officially a serious history fan, and I am very proud of you. If you want to learn more, check out the books in the description below. Leave a comment telling me, what was the most surprising thing you learned today? I read every single one. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more deep dives into the most incredible stories in all of human history. History is out there, and it is wild, and it is waiting for you.